Just after sunrise, London still looks untouchable. Glass towers along the Thames catch the first light. Luxury apartments stare down at streets where money moves before most people have opened their eyes. Private bankers are already on calls. Traders are watching screens. The city still carries the posture of an empire that once told the world how trade should work. But travel a few hours away from that skyline, and the illusion begins to crack. The old industrial towns are quieter now. Factory gates that once swallowed thousands of workers stand like monuments to another country. Local councils are cutting services. Hospitals are overloaded. Schools are short of staff. Families count every pound before the month is over. And in some parts of Britain, the future does not feel like a promise. It feels like something that already left. That is the strange tragedy of modern Britain. One city still looks rich enough to rule the world. The rest of the country is asking why that wealth never arrived. And the most disturbing question is not whether Britain is poor. Britain is not poor. It still has money, universities, banks, global influence, military power, culture, and prestige. The real question is darker. How did a country that once governed much of the world become so difficult to govern at home? To answer that, you have to look past the royal ceremonies, the red buses, the financial headlines, and the comfortable image of Britain as a stable old democracy. Underneath that image is a machine under pressure, and for decades, that machine has been moving in one direction, toward London, away from everyone else. The story does not begin with Brexit. It does not begin with COVID. It does not even begin with Liz Truss and the chaos of 2022. It begins in the late 1970s, when Britain was already losing control of something basic: prices. Inflation had become the enemy inside the house. Oil shocks pushed energy prices higher. Wages chased prices. Prices chased wages. Money was loose. Confidence was weak. A pound no longer felt stable in people's hands. Britain was not just uncomfortable, it was cornered. Then, in 1979, Margaret Thatcher entered Downing Street with a simple message: inflation had to be crushed. Not managed, not softened, crushed. The plan was brutal in its simplicity: tighten money, raise interest rates, cut borrowing, force the economy to slow down until prices stopped running. Interest rates rose sharply, borrowing became expensive, the pound strengthened, inflation began to fall. On paper, it looked like discipline, but on the ground, it felt like a hammer. Manufacturers were trapped. A stronger pound made British exports harder to sell abroad. High borrowing costs made investment painful. Factories that already lived on thin margins suddenly faced a world where money was expensive, demand was weak, and competition was growing. For many of them, survival was no longer a business plan, it was a countdown. And here is where the first deep wound opened. Britain did defeat inflation, but the cost was paid unevenly. London could adapt because London was moving toward finance, services, law, consulting, banking, and global capital. The old manufacturing towns did not have that escape route. Their wealth was built on plants, mines, shipyards, steel, textiles, and supply chains. When those industries broke, whole communities broke with them. When a factory dies, it does not die alone. So yes, Britain's GDP could rise. London could become richer. The financial sector could boom. But the question remained: richer for whom? By the mid-1980s, the answer was becoming visible. Parts of northern England, Scotland, and Wales were facing joblessness far above the levels seen in London and the southeast. The country was no longer moving as one body. It was splitting into different economic realities. One Britain was becoming global. The other Britain was being told to wait. Then came the Big Bang in the City of London. In 1986, financial deregulation transformed London's markets. Old rules were swept away. Fixed commissions ended. Electronic trading expanded. Foreign banks entered aggressively. The city became faster, richer, more open, and more powerful. For London, this was not just reform, it was rocket fuel. Global capital poured in. The skyline changed. Britain began to present itself less as the workshop of the world and more as a financial command center. The old empire had lost colonies, but London had found a new throne: money. At first, the numbers looked impressive. GDP rose. GDP per person rose. The country looked richer. But numbers can hide a crime scene. While national wealth increased, inequality rose. Manufacturing's share of the economy fell sharply. Manufacturing jobs disappeared. The regions that depended on those jobs were left with fewer ladders to climb. The country had not simply become more modern, it had become more unequal. The official promise was that the new economy would eventually lift everyone. But the new economy had geography. It had a postcode. It lived in London. That is why modern Britain often feels like one rich city attached to a struggling country. London has millionaires, billionaires, global headquarters, banks, elite universities, political power, and cultural gravity. It pulls talent, money, media, and government attention toward itself. Outside that orbit, the story can feel completely different. That contradiction becomes poisonous. People can accept hardship when they believe the system is fair. What they cannot accept forever is being told the country is rich while their own life becomes smaller. And then the housing crisis turned the knife. London was not only becoming richer, it was becoming harder to live in. The right to buy policy allowed many social housing tenants to buy their homes at deep discounts. For the people who bought, it could be life-changing. But for the future housing system, it created a dangerous problem. Large parts of the affordable housing stock were sold off, and not enough was rebuilt to replace it. A policy that created winners in one generation helped create scarcity for the next. Over time, some homes that were once social housing moved into the private rental market. Meanwhile, London became a magnet for global wealth. Foreign buyers could purchase property.
Wealthy international residents were drawn by Britain's tax rules, schools, banks, courts, and culture. Luxury flats became stores of wealth as much as places to live. Ordinary Londoners were trapped between two forces: low supply, global demand. The result was brutal. Even when London wages looked higher than the national average, housing costs swallowed the difference. Moving to London no longer looked like opportunity for many workers. It looked like economic self-harm. A city can be wealthy and still fail its own workers. That is the London paradox. The deeper tragedy is that Britain's policy choices kept feeding the same beast. Tri-investment leaned heavily toward London. Research and development spending leaned toward already successful areas. Private capital followed public signals. Skilled workers followed opportunity. Opportunity followed existing concentration. And the loop reinforced itself again and again. The places that needed the strongest push often received the weakest one. This is where the story becomes bigger than economics. When wealth concentrates too tightly, politics starts to fracture. People outside the winning region begin to suspect that the system is not slow, but rigged. They stop believing in promises about patience. They stop believing growth will trickle outward. They look at empty shops, weak buses, crowded hospitals, and unaffordable homes, and they ask a question polite politics does not like to hear. Who is this country actually working for? That question exploded in 2016. Brexit was not just a vote about trade rules, it was a scream from a country divided against itself. When Britain joined the European project in the 1970s, it gained access to a huge market. Goods could move with fewer barriers. British exporters could reach European customers with less friction. For many businesses, especially smaller ones, that access mattered. But by the 2010s, many voters felt control had been lost. Immigration, sovereignty, regulation, wages, identity, public services, regional decline, and distrust of elites were all thrown into one political furnace. For some, the European Union became the symbol of a system that no longer listened. For others, leaving looked like self-damage. The country voted to leave. And after the vote, the hidden cost started moving through the economy. A small exporter that once shipped into Europe with relative ease now faced customs declarations and paperwork. Large companies could hire teams to manage complexity. Small companies could not always do that. For them, friction was not an economic theory. It was time, money, stress, and lost customers. This is where the promise of taking back control hit the wall of economic reality. Control is not free. It has a price. Some estimates suggest Britain's economy will be smaller than it would have been inside the European Union. The exact number can be debated, but the direction of the shock was clear. Trade became harder. Investment confidence weakened. The political system was consumed by years of negotiation and anger. But Brexit was only the first blast. Then came COVID. The government had to borrow heavily. Businesses needed support.
Workers needed protection. The economy had to be held together through emergency spending. Debt rose. Public finances weakened. Then came the war in Ukraine and the energy shock. Gas prices, inflation, sanctions, supply disruption, and higher bills hit households and businesses. Britain entered the 2020s with stagnant wages, expensive energy, strained services, fragile growth, and a debt burden that left very little room for error. This is where the invisible government entered the room, not elected, not televised, not standing at a podium. The bond market. Most people do not think about government bonds. They sound boring. They look like technical paperwork. But inside modern states, bonds are oxygen. Governments spend more than they collect in taxes, so they borrow. To borrow, they issue bonds. Investors buy those bonds because they trust the government will pay them back with interest. But trust has a price. If investors believe a government is reckless, they do not need to shout. They do not need to march. They sell. And when they sell, bond prices fall. When bond prices fall, yields rise. When yields rise, future borrowing becomes more expensive. And when borrowing becomes more expensive, the government's room to act gets smaller. This is not drama. This is power. In September 2022, Britain saw that power in real time. Liz Truss entered Downing Street promising a new economic direction. Then came the mini-budget, large unfunded tax cuts, no matching spending cuts, and a signal to markets that the government was willing to borrow more without clearly explaining how the numbers would work. The reaction was savage. Investors dumped UK government debt. Yields spiked. The the pound fell. Pension funds came under severe pressure. The Bank of England had to intervene to calm the system. For a moment, the country that once set the rules of global finance looked like it had been ambushed by its own bond market. Then the humiliation became symbolic. A newspaper set up a live stream comparing Liz Truss to a head of lettuce. The lettuce won. After just 49 days, she resigned. Now pause here and think about what that means. A prime minister can win power through politics, but lose power through markets. So who really controls a country during crisis? Voters, politicians, or the people who decide whether to lend? The fall of Liz Truss looked like one leader's failure, but underneath it was something more dangerous. Britain had entered a doom loop. The loop works like this. High debt makes investors nervous. Nervous investors demand higher yields. Higher yields increase the government's interest bill. A higher interest bill leaves less money for services and investment. Weaker services and weaker investment hurt growth. Weak growth makes the debt burden feel even heavier, and that makes investors nervous again. Round and round it goes. Every turn tightens the chain. The government has two obvious doors, but both are partly locked. Door one says, grow your way out. Invest in infrastructure, skills, housing, science, energy, transport, and productivity. Make the economy bigger so tax revenue rises. But investment often requires borrowing, and borrowing can scare the bond market. Door two says, cut and tax your way out. Reduce spending, raise taxes, calm investors, and show discipline. But austerity can weaken growth, anger voters, damage services, and still fail to solve the debt problem. So Britain stands in a corridor with two doors that both lead to pain. This is why the country feels frozen. The NHS struggles with waiting lists. Schools struggle with staff and buildings. Local councils struggle to fund basic services. Infrastructure projects become political battles. Every government promises renewal, but the money is already being eaten by past decisions, present crises, and future fear. And while the state was squeezed, the social contract began to thin. For decades, Britain offered a quiet bargain. Work hard, follow the rules, pay taxes, and the country will give you stability, a decent home, a functioning health system, a school for your children, roads and trains that connect opportunity, a pension after a lifetime of work. But when housing becomes impossible, wages stagnate, services collapse, and taxes rise, that bargain starts to look broken. People do not only lose money, they lose faith. And once faith goes, politics becomes dangerous. This is where the non-dom story matters. For generations, London attracted global wealth partly because Britain had a tax status that allowed some wealthy residents whose permanent home was considered abroad to avoid UK tax on foreign income and gains if that money stayed offshore. This made London extremely attractive to international elites. For Britain, this brought benefits. The wealthy spent money, they bought homes, they hired staff, they used services, they paid some taxes, they added glamour and capital. But there was also a cost. Their presence helped push up high-end demand, especially in London property. It made the city more global, but also more detached from ordinary citizens. It fed the sense that Britain had become a safe deposit box for the world's rich, while its own people struggled to rent. Then the political mood changed. The Labour government moved to abolish the non-dom regime, aiming to raise billions over several years by taxing wealthy residents more fully. On paper, the idea looked popular and fair. If you live in Britain, you should pay like others. But capital is not a prisoner. It can move. Some wealth migration reports estimated that thousands of millionaires left the UK in 2025, though other groups questioned whether those numbers were inflated. The exact scale may be debated, but the warning was clear. When countries tax mobile wealth aggressively, some of that wealth can leave. And when it leaves, it does not only take a tax bill. It can take investment, spending, business activity, property demand, and confidence. This is the trap. If the government is too soft on the rich, voters feel the system is unfair. If the government is too aggressive, capital may walk out the door. Either way, someone pays. The question is who? And that question is now tearing through British politics. For centuries, Britain's political system was built around a familiar rhythm: two major forces competing for power. The names changed over history, but the structure stayed recognizable: government, opposition, swing voters.
Stable alternation. But in recent years, that structure has cracked. Voters have scattered across Conservatives, Labour, Liberal Democrats, Greens, Reform, Nationalists, and Independents. In a first-past-the-post system, this becomes explosive. A candidate can win with a small share of the vote if the opposition is split. Large numbers of voters can feel unrepresented even after participating. This is how a democracy becomes technically functional but emotionally unstable. The ballot boxes still work, the trust behind them weakens. And when trust weakens, every decision becomes harder. Tax rises become betrayal, spending cuts become cruelty, immigration becomes a battlefield, housing becomes a generational war, infrastructure becomes a fight over who deserves the future. Britain is not facing one crisis. It is facing several crises stacked on top of each other: productivity, housing, regional inequality, debt, public services, political trust, and above all, geography. Because the map itself tells the story. Look at London and you see density, money, transport, institutions, private capital, universities, embassies, airports, and opportunity. Look at many other regions and you see potential trapped behind weak investment, poor connectivity, lower wages, weaker job markets, and years of promises that arrived as speeches, but not as roads, trains, labs, or factories. Trance decides how far opportunity can travel. If a worker cannot reach a better job, that job might as well be in another country. If a business cannot move goods efficiently, it becomes less competitive. If cities outside London are not connected to each other, they cannot create the scale needed for growth. Bad infrastructure shrinks a country without moving its borders. R&D tells the same story. When government research money and private capital concentrate in already successful places, those places become even stronger. Better firms attract better workers. Better workers attract more firms. More firms attract more investment. More investment attracts more political attention. The winning region wins again. The losing region is told to become more productive without being given the tools to do it. That is not a strategy. That is a cycle. This is where I want your opinion. Can a country truly level up poorer regions without first taking a political risk and moving serious money away from the richest region? Or will every government talk about balance while quietly feeding
the same capital city. Britain's great problem is that everyone can see the imbalance, but correcting it requires sacrifice from the places that already hold power. London does not need to conspire to dominate Britain. The system already bends toward it. Government departments are close to it. Financial institutions are inside it. Media attention lives there. Foreign investors understand it. Skilled graduates move toward it. Even when politicians promise to look beyond London, the gravitational pull remains. This is why Britain's decline is not a simple collapse. It is more like a slow internal separation. London continues to operate like a global city-state.
The rest of Britain carries the emotional memory of a country that used to build things, export things, and believe its children would live better than their parents. The empire is gone, the factories are reduced, the coal mines are closed, the old industrial identity has faded, and the replacement economy has not reached everyone with equal force. That creates anger. But anger alone does not build a future. This is Britain's deepest challenge. It cannot simply bring back the past. The old empire is not returning. The old manufacturing world cannot be recreated exactly as it was. The coal economy is gone. The age of commanding global trade through imperial power is gone. So nostalgia becomes a dangerous drug. It gives emotional comfort, but not economic repair. The real question is whether Britain can build a new model before public patience runs out. That model would require housing reform serious enough to make cities livable again. It would require transport investment that connects regional economies, R&D spending that does not simply reward the already successful. It would require skills, energy infrastructure, planning reform, industrial policy, and political honesty about trade-offs. But honesty is difficult in a country tired of bad news. Every solution offends someone. There is no painless route out. That is why the British crisis feels so heavy. It is not a mystery with one villain. It is a system of locked rooms, deindustrialization, London's dominance, housing scarcity, Brexit friction, debt, market fear, and political fragmentation. Every door opens into another door. This is also why outsiders should study Britain carefully, because Britain is not a failed state. It is not poor. It is not irrelevant. It still has extraordinary strengths, world-class universities, deep capital markets, scientific talent, creative industries, strong institutions, English language advantage, military capability, diplomatic reach, and cultural power. That is what makes the story so serious. If a country with this many advantages can become trapped, then the trap matters. Other countries should look at Britain and see a warning. Britain's crisis is not only economic, it is psychological. For centuries, Britain told itself a story of competence. The island that ruled seas, the parliament that survived revolutions, the empire that built trade routes, the financial center that understood money better than anyone, the democracy that moved slowly but steadily. Now the story is less confident. 6 prime ministers in 9 years, a bond market panic, public services under strain, rich residents reconsidering their future, local councils in distress, young people locked out of housing, regions asking why the national economy seems to stop at the edge of London's commuter belt. This is not the image of collapse in one dramatic explosion. It is something quieter. A country discovering that prestige does not automatically repair pipes, staff hospitals, build homes, connect cities, or restore trust. The frightening part is that Britain still looks normal from a distance. But beneath the surface, the pressure keeps building.
and pressure has a habit of finding cracks. Maybe the next crack is a housing revolt.
Maybe it is another market panic. Maybe it is another political earthquake.
Maybe it is a generation of young workers deciding that the old bargain is dead. Or maybe Britain finally does what it has avoided for decades: admit that the country cannot survive as one golden city surrounded by frustrated regions. That admission would be painful, but it might also be the beginning of repair. A serious country would stop asking how to protect the illusion. It would ask how to rebuild the machine, not with slogans, not with nostalgia, not with one more speech about leveling up, but with decisions that change where money goes, where homes are built, where labs are funded, where transport connects, where young people can afford to live, and where industries can grow. That would mean accepting a hard truth. London's success is not the problem by itself. The problem is making London the substitute for a national economy. A country needs more than a capital. It needs a body, and Britain's body has been underfed for too long. The old industrial towns do not need pity. They need power, connection, investment, and a future that is not dependent on moving to a city they cannot afford. The young do not need lectures about hard work. They need housing that does not turn ambition into rent payments. Businesses outside London do not need speeches about productivity. They need roads, rail, skills, energy, finance, and customers. Public services do not need applause. They need capacity. And politics does not need another performance of outrage. It needs the courage to tell voters that every route has a cost, but doing nothing has the highest cost of all. This is the final question Britain must face. Is it willing to become a balanced country again? Or will it keep pretending that a rich London means a healthy United Kingdom? Because history is unforgiving to countries that confuse the wealth of the capital with the strength of the nation. Empires can survive defeat. Economies can survive recession. Governments can survive scandal. But a country cannot survive forever if millions of its own people feel like spectators in their own national story. That is how the center loses the edges. And one day, the edges stop believing in the center. And the trap was not built in one night. It was built through decades of choices, shocks, delays, and illusions. Inflation was crushed, but industry was wounded. Finance boomed, but regions fell behind. Housing wealth grew, but homes became unreachable. Brexit promised control, but added friction. Borrowing protected the country through crisis, but left the state exposed to markets. Taxing wealth promised fairness, but risked driving away capital. Politics multiplied into factions, but trust kept shrinking. Every move had a reason. Every reason had a cost. And now the bill is on the table. The empire once projected power outward. Modern Britain must now do something harder, repair itself inward. No navy can solve that. No royal ceremony can hide it. No financial district can replace it. No slogan can outrun it. Only serious choices can change the ending. So tell me honestly, what is Britain's biggest mistake? Relying too much on London, leaving the European Union, neglecting housing, or letting debt trap its politics? Write your answer in the comments. And if this story made you think, like the video and subscribe to Satch Uncovered, because the next collapse is not always announced by explosions.
Sometimes it begins quietly, inside the numbers everyone ignored.